Today I'm going to talk about theater organization, and I'm going to begin with giving you a number, giving you some terms and some names and some other things which throughout the semester, especially in the interviews, you will find various people making references to these organizations or using these particular terms. And so it's necessary then that you have an understanding of them in order to understand the references when they arise in the various interviews. One of the terms you're going to be hearing terms like professional, non-professional, equity production, non-equity, regional resident theaters, Broadway theaters, community theater, and all of these are terms that I'll try to straighten up today and perhaps give you a little understanding and background for what is going on. And then toward the end of the hour, we'll go into how this organizational change that happened in the U.S. theater in the middle of the 20th century profoundly affected the way we see theater today, and or most of all, the kind of theater that we see now. Let's start with legal status, and that is the theater is usually a legal entity in that it is selling a product or selling a service, and so therefore in selling that particular service, in collecting money for it, then it needs some kind of a license. It needs a legal status. And there are today two kinds of status, legal status, that you can apply for. You can be a for-profit organization. Now this is a term which is used for any kind of business which is in business or which is organized for the individual in that particular business who owns it, or the investors who are a part of that particular business, that they are there to make money. They are there to make a return on their particular venture. So therefore, we find then that there is a for-profit theater status. And we usually refer to this as the commercial theater. And that is that there, in most cases, it is nearly always these days especially, a group of people who are willing to invest some of their money into a production in the hope that that particular production will become successful, and that then from the box office return, which comes from selling tickets, from that box office return then at some point the investors, will make back the money which they put into the production, and certainly the hope is that they will then even make more than that, that they will indeed make some profit from the money that they invested. So therefore, what we have here is a for-profit status. And when we say commercial theater, we should certainly also just as well understand that mean commercial films. And this, of course, is what happens when the investors invest in a film in Hollywood, which is then made and then is distributed throughout the United States in hopes that through that distribution that the box office will again return money to them for their particular investment. Commercial television. Now, commercial television is a little different in that as an audience members, we don't pay to see, or we don't pay directly to see commercial television. What we receive commercial television free in our abodes, but what does happen is that the commercial television makes its money from the ads that are sold, which one then has as one is viewing commercial television, and you arrive at a point where there is a break and we go to ads. And so from those ads are bought, sold by the television, bought, and then, of course, in turn, in hope that you as an audience member will somehow or the other see something that you want, and you will go out and buy whatever it was that was being advertised to you on television. So while you may not necessarily, while you may certainly have free television in many ways, whether you recognize it or not, you are certainly being enticed to go out and to spend your money and to part with your money in some way, so thus commercial television. So all of this is a for-profit status, and that is that the investors, the individuals, are going to make money on this particular product. Now, the other legal status that one can have is a not-for-profit status. There are certain kinds of, not everybody and anyone can have a not-for-profit status, but there are certain kinds of organizations which exist for charitable, for artistic, for public good, which are then allowed to be organized under the status of not-for-profit. Now, don't get confused just because it is called not-for-profit. Please don't get confused that in some way or the other that you think this means this organization can't make money. In fact, most of these organizations do hope that they make money, but what happens is here is that the money does not return to individuals, as we have indicated, or to investors, as we had indicated would be true in the commercial world. But what instead happens is the profit returns to the organization. So the profit stays within the organization. So therefore we have theater companies throughout the country which exist under a not-for-profit status. And yes, they may well have many people who work for them, and all of these people work for salaries, and these people are paid for the money that comes into the not-for-profit organization, not-for-profit theater company. And at the end of the year, it is certainly hoped that there is going to be some kind of profit left over, because that then can return to the organization and will give them some kind of cushion for the year, for the next year that is coming. This then is possible that because of this, that the company can make some experiments, that maybe they don't necessarily have to have every single box office pay off the complete particular production for that at that time, because they have a cushion of some kind that they have accumulated, and so therefore this is what the profit is there for. It becomes a cushion for them in case they arrive at a time where they cannot pay completely for the production at that particular time. So therefore we have a legal status: for profit, not for profit. Okay. Next, let's look at the kind of mode of organization. And this comes from the status of the individuals, and that is, are the individuals with this particular organization, are they paid or are they not paid? And in this case then, we then divide them into two categories: professional and non-professional. Now, this is nothing that you can't understand, and something which is in any way new to you. Almost all of you are certainly aware of the sports world, and you are very much aware of the professional sport, and you are aware of the non-professional sport, although frequently in the sports world it is called amateur, although in many ways the word amateur somehow has taken on a kind of negative connotation, and so consequently in many ways we avoid that word these days, and in the theater it's usually called the professional and the non-professional, but non-professional, amateur, whatever it is you want to understand, however you want to use it there. So let's look first at professional. Professional indicates then that the individuals who are involved in this particular, in the case of theater, who are involved in this particular production are receiving payment of some kind for their services, their talents, their time, their energies. So therefore, they are professionals. They are being paid for this. They are being paid for that which they can do. And then there is non-professional. Now, non-professional theater can break down into several categories. The two most prominent are, it can be an educational theater or it can be some kind of avocational theater. And by avocational theater, what we frequently mean is it is called a community theater. And that is, for example, here in Springfield, we have an organization called Springfield Little Theater. Springfield Little Theater is a community theater. It is an avocational theater. While there are certain people within the Little Theater staff who are paid, and that is, these are the people who are the director, the manager, or other key services, while they are paid for their services, most of the people who are involved in the production and the people whom you see on stage, these people are not paid for their services, they are volunteers. Now, this does not mean that they are unqualified. This does not mean that they are untrained. In fact, many of these individuals, especially the actors, may have received very good training while they were in their college or university. But it just meant at some point in time, they decided that they were not pursuing a professional status, and that they went to and they found some other means whereby they would make their livelihood. But in order to tap into their creativity, to tap into their particular artistic nature, then what they do is they volunteer to become involved in the activity of the production of theater. They may be actors. They may be some of the technicians backstage who may be painting or working. They may be the stage hands. They may be people who will go out and look for the properties, that is, those items that are used to decorate the stage or the set, those items that are used by the actors of one kind or the other. Obviously, if you have a scene wherein you need to shoot somebody, you need a gun. Well, where has that gun come from? Well, it means, among other things, some property person somewhere or the other went and found a gun. Maybe the gun was bought. Maybe the gun was simply lent to them. Who knows? But whatever it is, some properties person found that gun, and that gun, which is very essential at that particular moment, then is certainly a very necessary part of the production. And that's a very special technique that it has, and that is people who love to go out and search out and find the particular properties that belong on stage. So all of that, however, is a part of the non-professional nature that we are talking about here. Some people may be paid, but most of them are not. Most of them are volunteers who work. So we have professional, non-professional. Now let's back up and look at professional, because one of the terms that you're going to hear referred to a number of times throughout the semester is going to be, is this an equity production or is this a non-equity production? Now, in this particular case, equity is going to refer to the status of the actors. Now, by status of the actors, meaning professional indicates the actors are being paid. Okay, so we're talking here in terms of professional. We have already said professional means that they are being paid. Now, we are talking here then in terms where we say equity It means that the particular actors, or most of the particular actors who are appearing in this production, are members of Actors Equity Association. Any organization that hires an equity actor must reach a certain salary scale. There is a minimum level that must be met. Now, depending on the geographic location of the organization, the seating size of the theater, and various other factors that have figured in, Actors Equity has set up a minimum pay scale that belongs or fits that particular organization. So therefore, an equity actor who appears in a production with that particular organization has to be paid at least the minimum. Now, may be paid more, certainly in many cases may be paid a great deal more, but it does mean that there is a certain level that that particular actor is going to receive. And once you are a member of Actors Equity, once you have joined the union and you have paid your dues, and there are yearly dues, then at that point you must always work under an equity contract. Under certain conditions, a non-equity organization may hire an equity actor, but in so doing, then that organization must then go through the Office of Actors Equity, must work with Actors Equity and set up a special contract which allows that non-equity organization to hire the equity actor and for the equity actor to appear in the production. But it does mean that that particular organization has guaranteed that the actor will be paid whatever, at least will be paid the minimum of whatever this is, whatever the scale is that this particular organization will be working under. Now, the same similar situation exists in film. If you are working in film and you're working in Hollywood, then you must join SAG, S-A-G, Screen Actors Guild. If you are working in commercial television, then you must belong to AFTRA, A-F-T-R-A, the American Federation of Television and Radio Artists. All of those unions then guarantee that by being members in the organization, by paying the dues to continue in the organization, then when you sign your contract, that there is a certain minimum level that is going to be reached and that you are guaranteed that you will do this. Now, there are, indeed throughout the country, there are theaters that exist that are professional theaters but that are non-equity organizations. And that is, the actors may be paid for their services, but they are not necessarily being paid and usually are not meeting what is the equity minimum. These days there are many touring companies that are organized in New York, leave out of New York, but hire only non-equity actors. And those touring companies then travel throughout the country, appearing in what are usually called roadhouses, appear in various theaters throughout the country, presenting their performances, and you are paying for what you are seeing at the box office, but it means that the company is not an equity tour. Now, it doesn't mean that a non-equity production is going to be bad. In fact, there can be very good non-equity productions. It does mean, however, in most cases, that the actors are usually not going to be, or not going to be experienced, or they're not going to have had as much experience as an equity actor will have had, and an equity production will show. So therefore, what you should always do anytime if you are going to see a touring production, ask, is this an equity production or is this a non-equity production? It's still not going to tell you how good the quality is. I have seen many equity production which has not necessarily been of the highest quality. I have seen productions in New York, which in some cases I wondered, why was this particular production there? The quality was not particularly, the artistic quality was not necessarily high. But there is usually, and this is just one can say as a sort of rule of thumb, there is usually a kind of assurance that there is going to be a higher quality product involved if it is an equity production than if it is a non-equity production. But that's just something where it's a gamble, and consequently you just have to sort of take the gamble and go see. All right, now, the other way, which is a very, in which we can look at theater organization, is by geography. And this becomes a kind of self-centered one, that is, in terms of, so far as New York is concerned, there are two kinds of theater. And that is, there is the theater which is in New York, and there is everything else which is outside New York. And anything outside of New York is usually called regional theater. It is regional to the New Yorker because it is outside New York, and so therefore it gets that name. Now, within the geographic location and within New York geography we're talking about, there are references, and you will hear us frequently talk throughout the semester about Broadway productions. A Broadway production refers to a production that started and appeared in New York, appeared in what is called a Broadway theater. And this really becomes something quite narrow, and that is quite narrow and quite small in terms of number. And that is literally what we mean in terms of Broadway when we're referring to New York, and specifically, of course, then to Manhattan, is we are referring to a very narrow strip that exists somewhere between 40th Street on the south to 52nd Street on the north, so it's about 12 blocks in between 6th Avenue on the east to 8th Avenue on the west. And at this point you say, well, where does the word Broadway comes from? And the word Broadway comes from that running, sort of straddling, running right down through the middle of that is then the street called Broadway. Although most of the theaters that appear are not actually on Broadway themselves, but they are all within those blocks that I have just indicated here, so therefore they are associated specifically with Broadway. Broadway theater is always commercial. Broadway theater is there always a for-profit. It is always professional. It is always equity professional. Plus, in the case of Broadway theaters, all of the other unions, every single person who works in a Broadway theater belongs to a union of some kind, from the people who usher you in and give you a program and may show you to your seat, all the way to all of the crew and all of the actors. All of these people belong to unions. All of these people have scale and have salary scales. And so therefore, anytime you go to the theater there and you buy a ticket, a part of that ticket will go to help pay for some particular person who belongs to a particular union. I'm going to go into this a little bit more in another program. But once you begin to realize the totality of the number of people who are being paid who work in Broadway houses, then at that point you can begin to realize perhaps why, if you do go to New York and if you do go see a Broadway show, you are going to pay $60, $75, $80, or $100 for a ticket, because it is that particular ticket is supporting many, many individuals concerned with the production. Now, there are many other theaters that exist in Manhattan that do not fall into this special jurisdiction that I just talked about that is called Broadway, and they are called Off-Broadway. And there is also a thing called Off-Broadway, but let's just label and everything else that is a non-Broadway theater, that is going to be Off-Broadway. Now, the Off-Broadway theater, again, is usually professional. It is frequently, although not always, but usually frequently equity productions in some way, but they are on, that is, all of those theaters are on a different pay scale from the Broadway theater. And because of this, then, this is one of the places where an off-Broadway theater, many and much of the experimental theater can go on, because it can afford to take more of a chance than you can with the very, very expensive Broadway productions. Now, the other thing we have to understand here is that during the first half of the 20th century, New York theater, and specifically and usually Broadway theater, and so therefore commercial theater, dominated dominated the theater in the United States. Most of the productions that were produced then throughout the country began in a Broadway house. And if it were successful, then it would be given other productions. Also, professional theater in the first half of the 20th century usually meant that professional theaters came through touring companies that would be cast in New York, originate in New York, and then would move out and play in theaters that existed in cities across the whole United States. Even in Chicago, which at that point in the middle of the century was the second largest city in the United States, even in Chicago, while there were a few local theaters there, of which the most notable was the Goodman Theater that had been founded about 1925 or so. But to most people in Chicago, if they were going to the theater, then that meant going into the Loop, and at that point then going to one of the touring houses such as the Schubert, the Blackstone, the Erlanger, the Studebaker, those various theaters that were there within the Loop, and they would see a touring production which had originated in New York and would then come into Chicago and play, and maybe even play for quite some time. Maybe it would be there for 2 weeks or 4 weeks or 6 weeks or 8 weeks, or who knows. Knowing the popularity of the production, they would gauge how long they thought that particular production would last in Chicago. But notice that what we're still talking about is productions that originated in New York and then came and toured then out of New York and played across the country. Now, during the same time that we're talking about, there is, yes, a great deal of non-professional or amateur theater organizations that are organized and are presenting theater in in their local community. And again, just for an example, we mentioned earlier the Springfield Little Theater. The Springfield Little Theater was organized in 1934 and rather continuously, with a few exceptions, from 1934 down to the present day, it has continued to present productions. At first, it had no home at all, and that is, it would rent or borrow a theater from some particular group or the other, or a local university or college, and present its productions, but it had nothing that it could call home until 1970, when it purchased the Landers Theater, and at that point in downtown Springfield, and at that point it then became the Springfield Little Theater at the Landers Theater. The Landers is simply the name of the theater building or the theater house in which Springfield Little Theater produces and presents its particular productions. But that is still a non-professional, it is still an amateur organization. And if professional theater wanted to be seen, then it came through touring productions that would come through. Now, however, in the middle of the century, what we begin to find is one of the great major changes that happened to American theater in the 20th century, one of the most important changes that happened to American theater in the 20th century. And in many ways, this is going to start with the Ford Foundation. And that is, it happened when the Ford Foundation decided to make a major change in the way it was granting and looking money, and that is that it would include within the organizations to which Ford Foundation, in which it would make money, that it would at that point grant money to artistic organizations. McNeill Lowry, who at that point was with the Ford Foundation, later wrote of this particular point, of this particular time. In 1957, when I had been at the Ford Foundation for 3.5 years, the trustees first authorized a program in support of the arts. As director and later vice president of the new program, I and a small staff began working with the professionals in each area of the arts to develop objectives for organized philanthropy, the first undertaking in American history on such a national scale. The Ford Foundation's aim in nurturing the theater was to offer American artists a clean slate, to encourage them to build companies devoted to process. In other words, to foster the coming together of American directors, actors, designers, playwrights, and others beyond a single production and beyond a commercial sanction. This motive intrinsically contained the seeds of a plan which came into sharper focus through the staff work of the program in humanities and the arts. In 1957, the Ford Foundation published its statement, "The theater in America was an artistic resource like music and the visual arts, and should not be regarded as commerce and entertainment." It made a crack in the wall which theater artists still can exploit. What McNeill Lowry is pointing out here then is that, as we said, the New York theater, the commercial theater dominated the professional world. Now what happens is the Ford Foundation recognizes that the theater can indeed have artistic purposes and artistic existence, and that it does not have to be only commercial. This then brought a change of status, a recognition to theater which had not existed prior to this particular time. Encouraged by the Ford Foundation then, a group of individuals came together in 1959 to hold a conference. And this particular conference was indeed historic, because it is here then that the foundations for the way the theater was to be organized in the United States was to take place. In this particular conference, they sort of came up with the following findings. There is a greater ability and willingness to experiment outside of New York commercial conditions. There is also a limit to how far you can experiment behind a proscenium arch. This is a reference to the particular kind of theater, and it's something that we will talk about and develop at another time. The important goal is the opportunity to go wrong, to try out something which is practically impossible in New York. And that is, when you are in a commercial situation, when your investors have put the money into the production, then at that particular point is the hope and the intent of those investors, we're going to get our money back, we're going to make a profit on that money in somehow or the other. So therefore, the attempt to try out something was not necessarily frequently present here. Another finding, all over America, it seems that people are feeling some kind of stir, some need for theater. How can we put together theater artists responsible to each other as artists, supported by the Ford Foundation without commercial penalties? How then does this differ from the off-Broadway theater that exists in New York? It is going to be different in its very roots. Even in the most idealistic aims of off-Broadway, it always still comes back to the commercial exploitation. If there is some way to help professional actors work together through even 2 productions, we will have broken through. And this is exactly what the commercial producer will not subsidize. So it is from that conference then in 1959 that a number of individuals began to come together and to say, we wish to create a theater in America outside of New York. We wish to create a theater which belongs to the community in which we exist. We are not a touring company that's just going to come in and put down for a few days, a week, 2, 6, 8, whatever that amount of time may be. We are instead, we are going to be a theater that belongs to the community. Now, there were already a few examples around the country, not many, but there had already begun to be a few examples that one could look to. As early as 1915, the Cleveland Playhouse, which began as a community theater, but soon thereafter changed its status and became a professional theater, one of the first outside of New York City. And its intent as the Cleveland Playhouse was to create professional theater for the Cleveland community, to create a theater that belonged to the community, to create theater that was a part of Cleveland. And as the people who were members of the organization, that is the artists, who were members of the Cleveland Playhouse, that they were the citizens then themselves of Cleveland. We find, as I mentioned, the Goodman Theater in Chicago, 1925, that existed for much of those same purposes. The Goodman Theater was associated when it first started with the famed museum, art museum in Chicago. In fact, and for many, many years, its theater was on the back side, and that is, if one thinks of the front of the Chicago Art Museum was on Michigan Avenue, the Goodman Theater was all the way around on the street on the back side of the museum. In 1947, first both in Houston and in Dallas, 2 women, very strong-minded, strong-willed women, created theater in which they could work as artists and bring together other professional artists, theater artists, to work with them. Nina Vance created the Alley Theater in Houston, Texas, and Margot Jones created Theater in the Round in Dallas. The Theater in the Round no longer exists in Dallas. Margot Jones died in the 1950s, and the theater went out of existence. The Alley Theater, however, still continues today. It is no longer, it was literally named the Alley Theater because when Nina Vance started the theater, she found a building in downtown Houston which was in the business district, but it was quite literally behind behind the commercial district, and so you, commercial businesses, and you went down an alley. And when you got down at the back of the alley, then that was the entrance to the theater, and so therefore it acquired its name, the Alley Theater. Today, however, it does indeed have its own home, two theaters, which belong in a wonderful theater building, but it's still called the Alley Theater, and its founder was Nina Vance. In 1950, we find three young graduate students, one of whom, again, one of these very strong-willed women by the name of Zelda Fischhandler. That Zelda Fischhandler and her husband and a friend had recently finished graduate work in theater at Catholic U in Washington. They did not want to leave Washington. They liked living there. But they asked, why isn't there theater in this, which is the nation's capital? There is almost no theater. Some amateur theater, yes. No professional theater. There was the Roadhouse, the National Theater, and when one in Washington thought of theater, one thought of, you go to the National Theater, see some touring company which comes in from New York, and you see the productions, and that was professional theater. And so these three young graduate students said, wait a minute, we want to create professional theater here in Washington. We also do not want to create commercial theater. We want to create the theater, the vision that we have, and that we can collect an audience to come see. And so in this particular case, then, they then, in looking for a place for them to perform, found then in a not so reputable district, but in part of the industrial area in Washington, they found a beer brewery which had been closed and was no longer in use. And so they scraped the money together to rent the building, and as they went through the building, they found there was one enormous space within the building, which was the place where the vat room, where the vats had been at one point for a beer brewery, and these were now gone. So here was this enormous open space. And so now being inspired by the work of Margot Jones in Dallas, and that is her work in the round, and I'll talk another time about what we mean by theater in the round. They then created a theater in the vat room of the brewery, and because it was in the round, thus it was in a kind of arena situation, and maybe the easiest way to understand it is think of it like a basketball arena, and that is that the audience is sitting on all four sides around the arena, and then the acting space is that in the middle. Obviously, it is usually, in most cases, much smaller than a basketball arena. But if you understand that particular physical situation, then you understand what we're talking about when we say theater in the round. And so it is here then they created, and they named then their organization the Arena Theater. They struggled those first few years. They managed to keep it afloat, and they finally did succeed. And once then starting, and realize this is 1950 when they start, and once the Ford Foundation opens that gate for them, then it is indeed to the Arena Theater that the Ford Foundation turns and looks at as one of the models that they could possibly have for how theater might develop across the country. And thus then then the Arena Theater began to have a new source of funds here, and that is they could seek money from the Ford Foundation and other foundations, and eventually they were able, the members of that theater, were able to build their own new theater, and still called the Arena Theater, still in Washington, D.C., but a building in the complex of which they have 3 theaters now, one of which is still their traditional Arena Theater, then a smaller proscenium arch theater, and then a theater which is a kind of cabaret theater, which they call the Vat Room, in memory of and in honor of where they began in 1950. Now, there is one other important change that we need to go into at this point, and that is a broadening and a change in the federal tax laws. And that is, up until this time, theater organizations and many others were not considered a part of charitable organizations or organizations which could receive donations and then be included as a part of the taxable deduction on your individual federal income tax. But with the statement that the Ford Foundation made in 1957, and that is the recognition that theater was an art form, then the tax laws were changed in such a way that what had been then the donation laws in which one could give money to churches, to museums, to charitable organizations, this tax law was broadened so as to include most of the various arts organizations in the country, so long as they were organized under, and then we go all the way back to the beginning of the hour where we started, so long as they were organized under the not-for-profit status. So therefore we now have these two things coming together, the change in the tax laws, which allow then individuals, businesses, foundations, whatever else, to give money to arts organizations, to theater organizations, and this becomes then a donation that can be deducted from your federal income tax. Once that happens, then at that point, with the encouragement from the Ford Foundation, the floodgates are open. And by that meaning, starting then in the 1960s, there is a movement all across the United States. Almost every metropolitan city of any size whatsoever had then a theater company that was organized. They built an arts center of some kind or a theater center of some kind. One of the first and one of the most notable that happens here is in 1963, which becomes maybe the model here, and that is out of that conference which I mentioned earlier in 1959, a group of men who, in this case they were all men, but a group of men came together and said, we want to create a theater outside the New York commercial theater. We want to remove the organization from that particular situation, from the hothouse that New York is always in. And they made a study and looked at a number of major cities across the country and finally selected Minneapolis because they felt that the climate that they found, the artistic and cultural climate that they found in Minneapolis was of such a nature that they already had a major, in fact, a couple of major art museums, had a major symphony orchestra, had various other major cultural organizations that led them to believe that they could then open a theater company in Minneapolis. And so thus, in 1963, they opened what at that point was called the Minnesota Theater Company. They brought in to be the artistic head of that company the British director Tyrone Guthrie. And Guthrie had already started one previous organization, which was a model to some extent for the Minnesota Theater Company, but in this case it was in Canada, at Stratford, Ontario. In fact, just about 10 years earlier, in 1953, Guthrie had gone to Stratford, Ontario, and helped them start the Shakespeare Festival Theater there. And so now the Minnesota Theater Company asks Guthrie to come and to do the same thing here, to help them get on their artistic feet, to be the artistic director, to be the executive artistic manager for the company, to be then a director here, and also to create a physical building which would to some extent resemble the same physical or the same kind of physical building that he had helped create in Stratford, Ontario. And so Guthrie and his artistic associate, Tanya Masayevich, Tanya and Guthrie came, and they thus created the theater building, which was not to be a proscenium arch theater, because in fact they felt this is to be a theater of the word. This is to be a theater of Shakespeare in which we can present Shakespeare. The theater of Shakespeare was not a proscenium arch theater. And so therefore we do not want to create that kind of a theater building. We want to create a theater that thrusts out into the audience, that the audience can surround on three sides. And so they built then the theater building in which then in 1963 the Minnesota Theater Company opened and gave its first productions. Eventually, after Guthrie left the company and in honor of the work that Tyrone Guthrie had done there in being their founder, artistic director, and getting them on their feet artistically, the Minnesota Theater Company, the name was changed, and we know it today as the Guthrie Theater in Minneapolis. And it still continues down to the present day, one of the major regional resident theaters in the United States. We also find then, even here, I say even here, but we should certainly be aware that even within Missouri, we were certainly not immune to this fever that was sweeping the country. In 1964, Patricia McElrath, who was head of the department at what is now the University of Missouri, Kansas City, Patricia McElrath had a dream of opening a professional theater in Kansas City, and in the summer of 1964, taking over the theater building that was used by the department in the regular year. She gave for the first summer 2 productions that played that particular summer. And 4 years later, in 1968, the company moved, and it was a professional company, but in 1968 then joined and agreed to become a member of Actors Equity, and since that time it has been Actors Equity. It has been a professional equity company. In 1965, on the campus of Webster University was founded the Repertory Theater of St. Louis. They made as their home the theater that is called the Loretta Hilton Theater. This is the theater in which the Sisters of Loretto, who are in residence at Webster, the Sisters of Loretto had convinced Conrad Hilton, the owner of the Hilton Hotel chain, to make a major contribution to them to build a theater building, and so they built it, and it's called the Loretta Hilton, and then the organization was founded, the Repertory Theater of St. Louis, and it still continues down to the present day as a professional equity theater in St. Louis. What is very interesting is then, by 1970, Actors' Equity was to find that for the first time in the 20th century, more actors were being paid to act. In other words, they were working at that which they were trained and artistically had ability to do. They were being paid to work outside New York City than those who worked in New York City. And that has been true then ever since. By the time we arrive at the 1990s, there are in what is called LORT, L-O-R-T, the League of Resident Theaters. There are somewhere in the neighborhood of, and it varies, but usually 250 or so LORT theaters. All LORT theaters are professional. All LORT theaters are equity professional theaters. And therefore, as a member of LORT, we find that the American theater has been turned upside down. And that is that what used to start in New York, and that is that new plays were always given on Broadway and then toured and then were produced by various theaters, non-professional theaters across the country. New theater now begins in the regional theater, in the resident theaters. New York Broadway is far too expensive. It cannot afford to experiment. So what happens then is it now begins in the regional theaters, and if it is successful there, then it moves to New York, so that what happens Broadway these days is mostly a showcase theater. It is where it is, one might say, the cream, and that is the very best which has been done at regional theaters throughout the country may then move to New York. Or a new play which has been successful will then be given a Broadway production or a New York production of some kind or the other. This has turned the American theater totally upside down from where it was at the beginning of the 20th century. And that is, Broadway is still the pinnacle, but Broadway is no longer the beginner. Broadway is no longer where theater starts and begins. It begins in the regional theaters and then moves to Broadway. And yes, once it is moved to New York, it unquestionably receives that notice that it needs to make you aware of what is going on.